our 5th annual World Catholicism Week. And as every year, we have tremendously rich fare on offer for the entire week. I hope you take advantage of all the different sessions that we have this week. And we have no richer fare than tonight, where we welcome John Allen. In the recent flurry of media coverage over the Pope's election, there was only one person you would have seen on television more than Jorge Bergoglio, and that was John Allen. When I was called on to do a few media interviews, the first thing I would do was say yes, and the second thing would be go to look at John Allen's website and figure out what to say. John Allen is the prize-winning senior correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter and the senior Vatican analyst for CNN. He's the author of 6 best-selling books on the Vatican and Catholic affairs, and writes frequently for church and secular audiences. He's also a very popular speaker to all kinds of audiences on Catholic issues. The London Tablet has called him the most authoritative writer on Vatican affairs in the English language, and he has plaudits too many to mention from all sides, interestingly, of the Catholic spectrum, from conservative to liberal. He's the go-to guy that everyone can trust to give the straight, unvarnished truth, as it were. He's admired across the different ideological divides, and is a tremendous speaker as well as a tremendous writer. I'm using his class, or just got done using his class, his book, The Future Church, in my class, and it was far and away the most popular book in the class. So if you would please join me in welcoming John Allen to
Thank you, Bill. In fact, that was such a generous introduction that I feel obliged to begin with a small confession, which is that everything Bill just said to you is true, including the fact that I am CNN's senior Vatican analyst. But before anyone gets terribly impressed by that, I can think of 2 very good reasons why you shouldn't be. One is that in addition to being CNN's senior Vatican analyst, I am also CNN's only Vatican analyst. So I'm senior in a universe of 1. But the second and more substantive reason that I can think of that you should not be impressed is, and I don't know if this is something that has struck you over the years, but I found myself constantly dumbfounded by how little you actually have to know about a subject in order to sell yourself as an expert on that subject on American television. Have you people noticed this? I mean, it truly is remarkable. I'll tell you a quick story to illustrate the point. This goes back to 2002, which you will remember was the white-hot period of the child sexual abuse crisis in the American Catholic Church. And in April of that year, the news broke that Pope John Paul II was summoning all of the American cardinals to Rome for this extraordinary 48-hour summit on the crisis. Now, the day that news broke, believe it or not, I was not in Rome. I actually happened to be here in Chicago. I was giving a talk someplace that night. That morning, I had been invited to meet with the editors of U.S. Catholic Magazine to kind of do a Vatican 101 thing for them. So we're in this conference room around this big table, and of course everybody has their cell phone off, so I didn't know this story was breaking. We took a coffee break at some point in the middle of the morning. I stepped out into the hall and turned on my cell phone, and there were like 19 voicemails, from producers in Atlanta. And before I could even respond to one of them, another producer got me on the phone and said, John, what do you know about this story that the Pope is calling all the cardinals to Rome to talk about the sex abuse mess? And I said, well, look, I'm not in Rome today. I'm in Chicago. I've been in a meeting all morning. Despite what you think, I am not in telekinetic contact with the Vatican officials. So, the truth is, I know 0 about this story. 0. Nada. I got nothing. Okay? This producer's answer, I kid you not, this is a direct quote. Okay? Her answer was, that's great. Let's go live. And I did. And for the next 5 minutes or so on air, I proceeded to tease out the significance of this thing I had just heard about 30 seconds before. Now, in the spirit of the new Holy Father, sort of Jesuitically, the way I justify this to myself is under the category of preventing a greater evil. You know, had it not been me, it would have been someone who knew even less. And so that's how I make sense of it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here tonight to go live with you once again, but hopefully with a little bit more conscious forethought. Okay? I've been asked to talk to you about religious liberty and the Vatican's view of these issues. Before I do that, I do want to say how grateful I am to be here with you again tonight as part of this World Catholicism series, because I think this is a profoundly important contribution to the life of the American Catholic Church. Bill mentioned my book, The Future Church. There's a statistic that comes out of that book, which I never get tired of repeating, which is this, just some basic math. As of today, April 15th, 2013, there are slightly under 1.2 billion Roman Catholics in the world, and there are 67 million Roman Catholics in the United States. Now what that means, if you do the math, is that we American Catholics represent about 6% of the global Catholic population. 6%. Put another way, in at least some important respects, 94% of the Catholics in the world aren't necessarily like us. Okay? And to me, the payoff of that insight is that if there ever was, and I emphasize if there ever was a time when trying to understand the Catholic Church exclusively through the prism of American interests, American experiences, and American priorities, if there ever was a time when that made sense, that time is long since past. It simply will not cut it in the early 21st century. It doesn't do justice to the reality of who we are. Yet, unfortunately, we American Catholics often aren't very good about bringing that global reality of the faith into clear focus. I mean, actually, I would say, if there is an Achilles heel to Catholic psychology in the United States, it is that we often tend to be very insular in thinking about issues in the Church. And this is true left, right, and center. It doesn't matter what point of the compass you're on. But if you go into the DePaul bookstore and you survey the most recent crop of books by American Catholic writers, regardless of what point of view they come from, what you will find is that for the most part, the unifying feature is that their imagination ends at the limits of American airspace. Okay? So in American Catholic journalism, in water cooler conversation in the Church, when we say the bishops, quite often what we really mean is the American bishops. When we say the laity, quite often what we mean is the American laity, and more often laity who think like we. Okay? And when we say the Church, what we're often talking about really is the American Church. Okay? And as I've said, while conversation about the American Church is very healthy, it is not the whole Catholic story today. What this series does is try to bring that bigger and much more complicated and I think much more rich story into clearer focus in American Catholic conversation. So if you hear nothing else from me tonight, I hope you will hear this, all of you who are involved in this project. Thank you for what you're doing. This is profoundly, critically important, and it's an honor for me to be a small piece of it. Okay. By the way, for those of you who do a lot of public speaking, I really recommend this to you as a rhetorical strategy. Always start by flattering your hosts. Okay? If you do that, you can usually get away with murder. Okay? And we'll test that theory in a moment. Okay? Let me give you a sense of my game plan here tonight. I am planning to talk for about 45 minutes, and then I want to use the rest of our time as much as possible for questions, answers, commentary. I want this to be a dialogue rather than a monologue. As I said, I've been asked to talk to you about religious liberty and the view from the Vatican. So I'm going to try to do this in 4 phases. I'm going to begin with a broad observation. I'm then going to give you a premise about religious liberty in the Vatican. I'm going to spend most of my time unpacking that premise. Then I'll end with a final thought, sort of about what all this means for the American Catholic Church specifically, and then we'll transition to whatever you want to talk about. Okay? Let me begin with a broad observation. The subtitle of this talk is A View from the Vatican. And whether the subject is religious liberty or anything else, I would say the view from the Vatican right now is a bit murky. Okay? That is, things are in flux. You may have noticed, if you weren't living under a rock for the last 2 months, we've had a change at the top in the Holy See. Okay? And whenever there was a change at the top in the Holy See, obviously that creates a period of uncertainty until the new pope's priorities and ways of doing business and so forth come into clear view. Now, as I say, that is always the case. I would say that the uncertainty is even a bit deeper this time around. That is, there's a sense that the election of Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio as Pope Francis may portend even deeper change than is always the case with any papal transition. Because I would submit to you that the conclave of 2013 was the most clearly and strongly anti-establishment conclave in the last 150 years. I think you would have to go back to the election of Leo XIII in 1878 to find another time when the cardinals who elected the next pope so self-consciously and clearly meant to reject something, some piece of what had gone before. Okay? Now, obviously what these cardinals were rejecting was not the substance of the papacy of Benedict XVI. That is, his analysis of the relationship between reason and faith and the role of religion in a postmodern secular world. Not at all. But what they were rejecting was a particular way of taking that vision and translating it into a program of governance, okay, beginning in the Holy See and then spreading out, radiating out to other levels of the life of the Church. That is, this was a clear, self-conscious vote against business as usual, particularly in the Vatican, a vote in favor of some new way of trying to make the Church's mission come alive in the world of the early 21st century. And that is the logic that led them to the election of a Latin American outsider in just 5 ballots. Now, what all that means is that it is even more difficult than what is normally the case with a transition right now to predict how things are going to work, what the priorities of this new papacy are going to be, who the key personnel are going to be, so forth and so on. And of course, we got one taste of that over the weekend with the news on Saturday that the Holy Father has commissioned this new group of 8 cardinals. It's actually 8 cardinals plus 1 bishop as kind of recording secretary, the Bishop of Albano in Italy, to act as sort of his kitchen cabinet. By the way, one thing to be clear about, if you've seen the news reports about the creation of this new body of advisors to the Pope, in some news reports, this has been labeled a body that's going to advise Francis on the reform of the Roman Curia. Okay? But go back and read the Vatican statement, because that's not what it says. What the statement from the Holy See says is that Pope Francis has created this group to first advise him on the governance of the universal church, and then only second, to study the document Pastor Bonus from John Paul II about how the Roman Curia works and make recommendations from reform. So to use a secular analogy, this is not a blue ribbon commission to handle a single task, like reforming the Social Security system or, recommending military base closings or something. This is more akin to the appointment of a cabinet who is going to advise the chief executive on basically everything. Okay? It is a very new way for a pope to do business, and we're going to have to see how it plays out. Okay? So, my point, we're going to talk tonight about religious liberty and how the Vatican engages those issues. Just bear in mind that a lot of what we're going to be talking about is going to be in the nature of speculation, because we don't know who the key figures in this administration are going to be yet, and we don't know how the new systems that Francis seems inclined to create are actually going to work. Okay? All right, that said, let me give you the premise. My premise is, religious freedom is destined to be the premier social and political concern of the Roman Catholic Church in the 21st century. And I think that's important enough, I'm going to repeat it. Religious freedom is destined to be the premier social and political concern of the Roman Catholic Church in the early 21st century. Okay? And now what I want to do is unpack why I think that is, and what it's going to mean in terms of Vatican priorities and sort of priorities for the global church. Okay? I think religious freedom is destined to enjoy a kind of pride of place in the first instance because of issues that we see metastasizing in the developed West, that is, Europe and North America. Okay? Now, obviously, in recent American Catholic experience, the crystal clear, the most obvious, most palpable example of ferment around religious freedom would be the sort of tug of war that is currently being played out between various religious groups in the states, including, of course, the American bishops in this country, and the Obama administration over the contraception mandates as part of healthcare reform. You don't need me to explain this to you because this has been front page news in the States for months. I think at this stage, the only thing we can say about it is that it is quite clear that that issue is not going away. Now, as you know, it's being litigated on a variety of fronts. There's every reason to believe that a short-term political solution to this issue is not on the horizon. And therefore, it's going to continue to be fought out not only at the level of Congress, but also in courtrooms all across the country. The point to be made, however, is that that is hardly the only example of growing church-state tensions. In the United States, we can find them all over the place. Last year, of course, the Supreme Court heard a challenge to the so-called ministerial exemption to federal hiring laws. This was a case that pitted the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission against a Lutheran church, I believe it was in Missouri, essentially challenging the right of a faith-based group in the United States to hire and fire on the basis of its creedal beliefs. Now, in this case, the Supreme Court sided with upholding the ministerial exemption. But there's no reason to believe that at some point people aren't going to go back to the well and try to challenge that again. We could continue multiplying examples. The point, however, is that institutional religious freedom in the United States, that is, the ability of faith-based schools and hospitals, ecclesial structures of various kinds, to be both robust participants in public life and also be true to the religious convictions that are their source of inspiration, that the ability to put those two things together is going to continue to be a source of legal and political tension in this country for the rest of our lifetimes. However, it's hardly just the United States. In fact, in many other parts of the West, the situation is even more dramatic. I could give you a number of examples, but let me cite just one case from the United Kingdom, which was the fallout of the so-called Equality Act that was sort of the last act of the outgoing Blair administration in the UK in 2009-2010. Ironically, this was Tony Blair's last act before converting to the Catholic Church, which was to create a great deal of heartburn for the Catholic Church in the United Kingdom, because one of the elements of the Equality Act is that it made it illegal for adoption agencies in the United Kingdom to refuse to serve same-sex couples. So we're not just talking about eligibility for public funding, to be clear. Okay, we're talking about the ability to operate a licensed adoption agency at all, regardless of whether you get public money or not. In effect, it criminalized refusing to serve same-sex couples. Now, the consequence of that for the Catholic Church in the United Kingdom were fairly dire. Prior to the Equality Act, the church in the UK ran about 24 adoption agencies up and down the country. By the way, they always received the highest ratings from the secular accreditation agencies every year because they would work with the poorest of the poor, and they would work with the hardest to place cases, that is, children with Down syndrome or other developmental difficulties and so forth, and they would try to find them loving homes. Now, when the Equality Act went through, one-third of those 24 Catholic adoption agencies shut their doors pretty much right away. That is, pulled the plug and went out of business. Another third of them chose to cut their ties to the church and reincorporate under civil law as basically secular entities, so they were lost to the Catholic Church. Another third of them chose to litigate. The last one that was involved in this litigation just lost its final appeal, so it too is closing. So in the end, probably when the dust settles, something on the order of 2/3 of these adoption agencies are going to be defunct, and another third of them will still be in business but no longer Catholic. Okay? Now, regardless of how we parse the rights and wrongs of that, my point is that it is another example, a particularly acute example of church-state tension in the West that we are likely to see multiply because there is no indication that secularism is going to exit the stage as a vibrant force in Western life anytime soon. Okay? So when I say that religious freedom is destined to be a premier social and political concern, that's part of what I have in mind. However, it is not the primary reason that I believe that religious freedom is destined to be our premier social and political concern. The primary reason I believe that it's destined to occupy that place in Catholic life is because of the much more dramatic threats to religious freedom unfolding in many other parts of the world. Let me try to put this to you in a soundbite, and then I'll unpack it. In a soundbite, in the United States or Europe, a threat to your religious freedom means that you might get sued. In many other parts of the world, it means that you might get shot. And I think many of us would agree that that rate's slightly higher on the urgency meter. Huh? Let me give you the statistics first, and then I'll give you some vignettes that lend sort of flesh and blood to the statistics. 3 key statistics. 1, according to the International Society for Human Rights, which is a secular NGO, a human rights observatory based in Frankfurt, Germany. So not a church outfit, but a secular human rights group. According to the International Society for Human Rights, 80%, that's 80% of all acts of religious discrimination in the world today are directed against Christians. Christians are, statistically speaking, by far today, the most persecuted religious body on the face of the planet, okay, by some order of magnitude. Okay. Second statistic, according to the Pew Forum, again, a secular organization, not a church outfit. According to the Pew Forum, the most widely respected, think tank on religion and public policy, probably in the world, certainly in this country. According to the Pew Forum, Christians face some form of discrimination or harassment in a staggering total of 137 countries on earth. 137. Now bear in mind, the United Nations only recognizes 193 countries. That means Christians face some kind of discrimination or persecution in 2/3 of the societies on earth. Now, in some cases, this discrimination is de jure, that is, it's an article of law. For example, in Saudi Arabia, where it is a cornerstone constitutional principle that the Quran is the country's constitution, which means that members of other religious persuasions, including Christians, cannot gather for public worship, they cannot import catechetical materials, they can't wear overtly religious symbols, and so on. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, there are today an estimated 1.5 million Catholics alone inside Saudi Arabia, an estimated 2.5 million Christians. Okay. Now those 1.5 million Catholics are not, for the most part, Saudi citizens. They are so-called guest workers, that is, Vietnamese, Nigerians, Koreans, Filipinos, Lebanese, and so forth, drawn to work either in the service industries in Saudi Arabia or in the oil industry. But a Christian, it's the most rapidly growing Christian population anywhere in the Middle East is in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, given the constitutional law of the country, it is very difficult to deliver pastoral care to those folks. Since the 19th century, it's the Capuchin Franciscans who have been charged with pastoral care of the Catholics in Saudi Arabia. 4 of those guys in the country, they can't set foot off the Western embassies or the oil industry compounds wearing their habits without the threat of arrest. So that's an example of de jure discrimination. Now, in other cases, the discrimination is de facto. That is, it's what actually happens on the ground as opposed to what the law says. Good example there, and we'll come back to this in a moment, would be India. India's constitution guarantees respect for religious pluralism, but on the ground, Christians are getting their teeth kicked in. And as I say, we'll come back to that story in a moment. Okay? But that's the Pew data. Well, out of 193 countries on earth, Christians face some kind of discrimination in 137. In the most bone-chilling bit of data of all, I think, according to the Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, which is the only outfit on earth that actually tracks this data, according to Gordon Conwell, 100,000 Christians a year over the last decade, so an average of 100,000 Christians a year for the last 10 years, somewhere in this world, have lost their lives because of their religious convictions. That's 100,000 new martyrs every year. What that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that for the next hour we are going to be together, if that number is accurate, somewhere in this world, 11 Christians are going to lose their lives. Okay? 11 new martyrs. We are, in effect, in the early 21st century, witnessing the rise of an entire new generation of Christian martyrs on a scope and scale that is truly staggering. Now, you should know there are some experts who dispute that number, that think it includes too wide a variety of situations, that in some cases the religious motivations for the persecution are not adequately clear. There's an expert in Germany, for example, who believes the number is, rather than 100,000, it's closer to 28,000. But whatever number you use, we are talking about truly staggering volumes, okay, of anti-Christian persecution. Okay. So those are the statistics. Let me give you a couple of vignettes that I think sort of lend human reality to those statistics. I think the most obvious spot on the map to go to, if you want to understand the stories of today's new martyrs, would be Iraq. In 1991, at the time of the first U.S.-led Gulf War in Iraq, there were an estimated 1.5 to 2 million Christians in the country. The majority were Chaldean Orthodox. There was also a very strong Chaldean Catholic population, also Assyrian Catholics, Armenian Catholics, and so forth and so on. Today, the high-end estimate for the number of Christians who are left is about 400,000. Realistically, most people believe it's closer to 200 or 250,000. Now bear in mind, this is a church, the Chaldean church, that can trace its roots all the way back to the apostolic era, okay? The first Christian century. So we're talking about a church that took 2 millennia to build up, that has essentially been gutted in the arc of 2 decades. Now, most of those Christians have gone into exile in various parts of the world. There are today, for example, more Chaldean Christians living in Australia and New Zealand than are left in Iraq. There are more Chaldean Catholics living in the suburbs of Detroit than are left in the city of Baghdad. But a staggering number of these people have also been killed. 36 of them lost their lives on October 31st, 2010, in the siege of the Chaldean Basilica of Our Lady of Salvation in Baghdad. Now, in itself, the fact that the church was bombed that day is unfortunately no novelty. Of the 63 Christian churches in Baghdad, 40 of them have been bombed at least once since the second U.S.-led invasion in April 2003. But what followed at Our Lady of Salvation that day was unusual, because what followed is, after the bombs went off, a cohort of armed Islamic gunmen stormed the church. They shot the priest who was celebrating Mass. They shot the 2 deacons who were assisting him. They shot 33 other people, leaving 36 dead. And they occupied the church for 6 hours until the Iraqi Defense Forces finally showed up to liberate it. Now, in Rome, not long afterwards, I had the opportunity to interview one of the survivors, a young Chaldean Catholic woman by the name of Fatima. She's in her mid-20s. Fatima was in the choir that day. Her choir mate to her left and her choir mate to the right were both shot dead. The way she survived was she fell to the floor and pulled their bodies over her and played dead for the agonizing 6 hours it took for someone to show up and liberate the church, thinking every moment that one of these guys was going to come by and deliver the coup de grace. Now, she now spends her every waking moment trying to help her fellow Iraqi Christians get out of the country because she is profoundly convinced that they don't have a future. Now, one hopes she's wrong, of course, but it is absolutely impossible to fault the experience or the reasoning that has led her to that conclusion. Okay. In miniature, that's the story of Christianity in Iraq today. And by the way, if I can just throw in one American Catholic aside to all of this, I am not one of these guys that finds a scandal under every rock. Okay, let me preface this by saying that. However, I do think that there is something deeply morally suspect about the fact that the concern of the church in Iraq is not a front burner, get out of bed in the morning thinking about it preoccupation in American Catholic life. Because I would suggest to you, we American Catholics have a special responsibility. Okay? As Catholics, obviously, we profess to be members of a communion of saints that cuts across time and through space, where the body of Christ, where the suffering of any one member of the body is our suffering too. That's our theology. As Americans, whatever you think about the merits of the 2 U.S.-led wars in Iraq, and there's a healthy debate to be had about that. I don't think the answers are by any means obvious. But whatever you think about it, it is empirically undeniable that it is those 2 interventions that ripped the lid off pre-existing tensions and created a context in which Christians are walking around with bullseyes on their backs. So both as Catholics and as Americans, I would suggest to you, we have a special responsibility here. And the fact that this is not preached about very much from the pulpits, that it is not a dominant conversation in the American Catholic media, that it is not a front-burner concern either at the leadership level or the grassroots. And this is one case where we cannot blame everything on the bishops, folks, because I don't hear this conversation at the grassroots either. Okay? That failure, to me, when the story of American Catholicism in the early 21st century is written, I think this is going to loom eventually as one of our greatest failures. Okay. Put it to you differently, okay, and this is slightly catty, but just roll with me for a second. I would say if we American Catholics had invested 1/10 of the time and treasure we spent over the last 20 years debating whether we should say, "and also with you," or "and with your spirit" at Mass, if we had taken that and invested it in gestures of solidarity for our suffering sisters and brothers in Iraq, ladies and gentlemen, we could have changed the world. And the fact that we didn't do that, I think, solicits a real examination of conscience for us. Okay? All right, so Iraq is one place where you can see this very clearly. But let me give you another. India. And I want to talk about India because I think there's a bit of mythology out there that the only place Christians face threats today would be in the world's 57 majority Muslim societies. Okay. 2 points about that. One is, it's a much more complex picture. Yes, there are some of those societies in which Christians have real problems. The other societies that can give you really amazing examples of peaceful coexistence. But secondly, and the more important point, is that if Islamic radicalism disappeared as a force in global affairs tomorrow, that would not make the world safe for Christianity. Because the truth is, the threats Christians face come from a bewildering cocktail of forces. India illustrates the point, because there the threat comes not from Islamic radicalism, it comes instead from a very robust and in some cases virulent form of Hindu radicalism and Hindu nationalism. Although Christians represent, all told, only about 2.5% of the Indian population, in a population that's well over 1 billion, that's a big pool of folks, okay? And they have become the sort of front burner targets for the rise of a very aggressively political form of Hindu nationalism that sees Christianity as the primary threat to Indian identity, to India's Hindu roots. According to the Global Council of Indian Christians, and in calendar 2011, there were a staggering total of 175 physical assaults on Christians someplace in India. 175. That's an average of one every other day. And I'm not talking about, insurance reform at the national level that creates some problems in terms of Christian policy. I'm talking about bands of Hindu radicals storming into a village, dragging a pastor out of his church, beating him within an inch of his life, and burning the church to the ground. The most violent anti-Christian pogrom anywhere on the map in the last 50 years took place in the northeastern Indian state of Orissa in 2008. Bands of Hindu radicals stormed into a series of Christian villages. They attacked the churches, they attacked the schools, they attacked the hospitals, they attacked the Christian-owned businesses, even Christian private homes, burning many of them to the ground. 50,000 Christians in this region of India had to flee to a nearby forest and take refuge 4 weeks until it was safe to come back. At least 100 people lost their lives. That's the official count. Many NGOs think it's perhaps 2 or 3 times as great. Thousands, tens of thousands were injured. The church there still has not recovered. Okay? And let's be clear, none of this is being fueled by Islamic radicalism. Okay? So the point is, it's a much more complex picture out there. And we could go on. We could talk about the realities facing Christians in places like China, or in Indonesia, or in Eritrea, or in much of sub-Saharan Africa. Even, ladies and gentlemen, some parts of Latin America. Okay? I mean, even though we think of Latin America, and we're right to do so, as an overwhelmingly Christian continent, that doesn't mean that it is free of anti-Christian persecution. In fact, one final story I'll tell you, one of the Catholic Church's most inspiring new martyrs of the year 2011 was a young woman by the name of Mary Elizabeth Mastria Castro, who lived in the Mexican city of Laredo, was the leader of the Scalabrian lay movement there, in effect a consecrated lay woman. She was also a journalist and blogger, and almost alone, heroically so. She was about the only voice in the local media willing to stand up to the narco cartels and expose their activities. And not just, in general thing, that drugs are bad, but I mean saying, these guys are bringing this shipment of drugs across this bridge at this hour, and everybody knows it, why don't the police do something? The mainstream media in Mexico typically doesn't do these stories, either because they're bought off by the cartels or because they're afraid of them. It was this one lonely blogger in Laredo who was doing it explicitly on the basis of her faith commitments. She knew the risk she was running, but felt called to do this because she believed it's what God felt and wanted her to do at that moment in time, given her skill sets and her abilities. Okay. For her trouble, she was kidnapped by one of the cartels, and they're known as las Zetas. She was beaten over a period of days, eventually killed. Her body was beheaded. It was left in the central square in the city of Laredo with a cardboard sign written in her own blood that said, "This is what happens if you mess with us." Okay? Catch my point, ladies and gentlemen. Mexico is the second largest Catholic country on the face of the earth. Okay? It is an overwhelmingly Catholic society. And yet, even there, when you make a stand on the basis of the virtues of the faith, you make a stand in defense of justice on the basis of your religious convictions, even there, it is hardly free of threats to expressions of Christian life. Okay? Those are the global realities of our times, folks. So when I say that the defense of religious freedom is destined to be the premier social and political concern of the Catholic Church in the early 21st century, it really is those realities I'm talking about. And that is not only because these stories and so many others we could tell are inherently compelling. They would beckon a response from any person of conscience. It is also because they are the front burner pastoral challenges faced by the leaders in the Catholic Church who are destined to set the tone in the 21st century. We live in a church in which 2/3 of the Catholic population today is outside the developed West. That share is going to be 3/4 by the middle of this century. In other words, within the arc of our lifetime, 3 out of every 4 Catholic men, women, and children alive are going to come from the developing world, okay? From Africa, Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, and so forth. In the 21st century, places like Mumbai and Abuja, and yes, Buenos Aires, are going to be what Paris and Louvain and Milan were to the Counter-Reformation era. These are going to be the primary centers of new political leadership, new pastoral models, new theological interests in the Catholic Church. And as that process plays out, the concerns of the Church in the developing world will increasingly occupy a front burner space in terms of the Vatican's own priorities and its own sense of what's important. And when you survey bishops and catechists and theologians and lay activists across the developing world, of course you'll hear a lot of different things in terms of what they're concerned about, but inevitably, the physical challenges, the challenges to life and limb that Christians in these parts of the world face, ever more so, typically, are the first thing they're going to talk to you about. To come back to where we began a moment ago, I talked about the creation of this new advisory council that Pope Francis announced on Saturday. These 8 prelates from various parts of the world who are going to advise him on church policy. Think about the points of the compass they represent. The Asian is Cardinal Oswald Gracias from Mumbai. Believe me when I tell you that Cardinal Gracias is acutely sensitive to the threats Christianity faces in India today and desirous of a much more vigorous diplomatic, political, and humanitarian response, not just from the Holy See, but from the Church in other parts of the world. The African is Cardinal Laurent Monsongo from the Democratic Republic of Congo. To go back to the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, they will tell you that the number 1 killing zone for Christians over the last 2 decades has been Congo. Okay. Catechists, pastors, bishops, archbishops, priests, seminarians, simple lay faithful, massacred by the thousands and the tens of thousands. Often not for explicitly religious motives, but they were carrying out activity that in their own minds certainly was explicitly religious. Okay? Cardinal Monsongo certainly will bring that concern with him to this advisory council for the Holy Father. Okay? And we could go on. My point is that the people who are going to be setting the tone for this papacy increasingly are people who feel these challenges in their bones and who want to see the Holy See pick it up and mobilize a much stronger and more vibrant grassroots Catholic response to all of this. Okay? Now, 2 final things. One, I know that being the practical Americans that we are, when you hear stories like this, the first question that most Americans want to ask is, what do we do about it? Right? We want a plan of action. And I think there actually are things we can do on many, many different levels. But let me just report to you, let me play the reporter for a moment, and report to you the number 1 thing that I hear when I interview victims of anti-Christian persecution in various parts of the world. Most recently, when I was in Lebanon on Pope Benedict's trip, he did this open-air mass on the Beirut waterfront, really gorgeous spot, and I had the opportunity to spend some time with a group of refugees, Christian refugees from Syria, who are convinced they're going to be the next Iraq, by the way. They are convinced that that's going to be the next Middle Eastern country where a police state falls, chaos arises, and Christians become the primary victims of the aftermath. Okay? These folks had come down in a beat-up old minivan for the Pope's Mass. And by the way, this wasn't a weekend excursion. They have no idea when or if they're ever going to be able to go home. Okay? They had basically packed a bag, said, we want to worship with the Holy Father, and they had accepted the reality that they probably will not be able to get back, at least for a considerable period of time, and maybe ever. Okay? So there we were. I was listening to their stories, listening to them talk about the perils they face simply driving the highway, down from Aleppo to Beirut. By the way, in Syria, the Armenian Catholics are basically concentrated in the northeastern zone of the country that's under Kurdish control, autonomous and pretty stable. The Orthodox are around Damascus, so they're in the part that's still under Assad's control, and they're fairly stable too. But the Catholics are concentrated in Aleppo and Homs, where the fighting has been the most intense. So they have been the heaviest hit community of all, the heaviest hit Christian community in Syria. These were Catholic refugees from Aleppo that I was talking to. And so I asked the pragmatic American question, what can we do for you? What do you need from us? And I was expecting them to talk about money or, send troops or don't send troops or whatever. Something material and concrete. You know what I heard? And this tracks with what I've heard over and over again with people in similar situations in other parts of the world. The first thing, and by far the most common thing they said to me was, don't forget about us. Don't forget about us. They have a profound sense of being isolated and forgotten and abandoned by the whole world. So if you want to know the number one thing we can do that would be most of greatest solace to these people, it would simply be to make it clear in every way that we have in our means that we have not forgotten about these people. And I'm telling you, that conviction that the church needs to make it clear that we have not forgotten, that is the animating pastoral conviction of a growing chorus of leaders right across the developing world, and I think it will increasingly set the tone for this papacy as well, because I am personally convinced that Cardinal Bergoglio, Pope Francis, as the first pope from the developing world, the first pope from Latin America, knows this in his bones too, and I think he would understand the providential logic for his election being in part to ensure that the agenda of the church from the developing world is heard carefully in the corridors of power in the Holy See, and this is a critical sort of linchpin element of that agenda. Okay? Final thing I want to say, and then we'll see what you want to talk about. What does all this mean for the Catholic Church in the United States? I doubt it will be any secret to anyone in this room when I say that in many ways the Catholic Church in the United States is a house divided against itself. Okay? We know that there are some very painful and often seemingly intractable divisions in American Catholic life. I was on air on CNN in, 5 days after the Pope's election, and we got the results of the CNN Opinion Research Center survey of American Catholics about Pope Francis, which found that 88% of American Catholics approve of the new Pope. And I said, this has got to be Francis's first miracle, because to tell you the truth, in a good period, it would be hard to get 88% of American Catholics to agree that today is Monday, okay, let alone what we might think of the new Pope, all right? And I have spent an awful lot of time trying to think my way through the reality of these divisions. We often talk about them in terms of polarization, right? The American church is polarized. I'm actually convinced that that's oversimplistic. I think the sociological reality of what we are is that we are tribalized. Because if you look around, that's what you see on the American Catholic landscape. Multiple tribes, right? We've got liturgical traditionalist Catholics, and we've got peace and justice Catholics, and we've got pro-life Catholics, and we've got church reform Catholics, and we've got neocon Catholics, and we've got Obama Catholics, and we got the movements, and on and on and on. And look, in principle, all of that diversity is healthy. It's what keeps us a church rather than a sect, okay? It's a blessing. When it becomes dysfunctional, however, is when these different tribes stop communicating with one another and start instead treating one another as ideological and political and theological enemies. And if we're honest with ourselves, too often that is the reality of our situation. Okay? Now, the question is, what do we do about that? Okay? How do we break out of that? And I said that I think there are two keys. Okay? One, we have to rebuild zones of friendship in the church across these tribal lines. That is, spaces in which Catholics from these different tribes can kind of rub shoulders and organically develop the friendships that will rebuild trust and create spaces in which a more unified Catholic witness to challenges can be put together. And I can say more about that if you want. But to me, the antidote to tribalization is friendship. Now, secondly, we need a transcendent cause. Okay? We need a cause that all the members of these different tribes can embrace and identify with, begin pooling resources in an effort to address, and again, create a kind of momentum in which the things we have in common are more important than the things that divide us. Looking around, my candidate for that transcendent cause would be the suffering church around the world. We Catholics in the United States, we may have different opinions about the Obama contraception mandates or many other issues. Okay? But surely, all of us can agree that Christians who literally take their lives in their hands every time they go to Mass, every time they go to a Christian school or a Christian social service center, for that matter, every time they walk down the street, surely all of us can agree that those people deserve our compassion and our support, the last best ounce of our effort, to try to ensure that the ranks of the martyrs of our time are not needlessly multiplied. In other words, if you're looking for a cause that cuts right across the ideological compass, left, right, and center, that ought to be able to galvanize us all, okay, I would suggest that it is this one. So, my point is that the urgency of trying to address the challenges of religious freedom of our time, seen through the prism of the globe and not just the United States, the urgency of doing so is not merely that people's heads are on the chopping block and we ought to do what we can to save them. It is also that in the effort to save them, in many ways we could have the capacity to save ourselves too. Save ourselves not from the threat of physical annihilation, thank God, in the United States, but from the threat of sterile, ideological, never-ending tribal conflict that means far too many of our resources are consumed fighting amongst ourselves rather than putting together a unified, coherent, and effective Catholic witness to the much greater challenges of our times. In other words, let's do what we can to help these people, not simply for them, but for us too. Okay? That's what I've got. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, John, for that typically lucid and gripping talk. I think
you gotta watch yourself, or you're going to end up in a book jacket one of these days.
I could listen to you talk about the Catholic Church all night. That's great. So we have some time, and anybody who would like to ask a question, please come up to the microphone and make yourself known.
Peter Glatz, Ottawa, Canada. Thank you. I mean, as usual, a brilliant presentation. I have two very different questions, but what both of them have in common is the whole problem of moral compromise. And the first one is, how can I put it? I kind of want to put you on the spot because you suggested that there was actually a legitimate moral debate. I'm not denying that there's a debate, but I'm wondering how legitimate the moral debate about the second invasion of Iraq is. So my question to you is, why do you think that at the time of the second invasion there wasn't more American Catholic resistance? And one of the reasons that I pose the question is, I mean, even though I live in Canada, I tend to follow, I'm actually a liturgist, so this is a kind of avocation, American church politics. But what surprises me, and I fully support what the American bishops are trying to do in opposing the HSS mandate, but it constantly surprises me that there wasn't an analogous analogous mobilization of energy around the time, or at least that's my sense, that there wasn't an analogous mobilization of energy to protest and resist the second Iraq invasion. So that's a question that relates to moral compromise. The second one is a lot shorter, and it's at the speculative level. What do you think that the nunciatures, and the Vatican itself possibly, are going to end up morally compromising on in various countries in order to avoid persecution?
Thanks, Bob. First of all, we were chatting before. You're a Ukrainian?
Ukrainian Catholic,
Yeah, the Ukrainian Catholic.
Shades of Ostpolitik.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
get nervous.
Well, let me say, first of all, since we have at least one Ukrainian in the room, that I owe a huge debt of gratitude to the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine for awakening me to this whole issue of anti-Christian persecution. Because my first taste of it actually came on John Paul II's 2001 trip to Ukraine. I don't know if you all remember this. You know, the apple of John Paul's eye, the most cherished dream of his heart, is that he wanted to go to Russia, right? But it became clear by that point in his papacy that it was never going to happen, so that Ukraine was the closest he was ever going to get. And so it was a huge deal. Now, Kiev is the capital of Ukraine, but that tends to be an overwhelmingly Orthodox part of the country. The Catholics are concentrated in the western Ukraine, what we once upon a time called Galicia, in Lviv. And so John Paul's final act was this huge open-air mass in this airfield in Lviv, right? 2 million people showed up for the thing. It had rained terribly the day before, and it was raining again terribly that morning. Now, me being hyper-organized American reporter that I am, I had brought my laptop and my satellite phone and my trip books and my, 3 different, histories of the Catholic Church in Ukraine. The one thing I didn't have that I actually could have used that day was an umbrella. Now, the Ukrainians, being the endlessly entrepreneurial people that they are, had created this big market, okay, at the back of the mass site where they were selling everything. I mean, I'm not making this up. You could have had your tires rotated that day at the mass. You could have bought a washer and dryer, okay, anything you wanted. However, they were, of course, completely sold out of umbrellas. Now, finally, this Ukrainian cop takes pity on me, and he gives me this plastic poncho. And so I'm now trying to make my way back through this swamp, basically, to the press tent. And out of the corner of my eye, I catch this young Ukrainian woman by herself, on her knees in the mud, okay, and she's just weeping. And obviously my curiosity was awakened, so I waited for her to kind of compose herself. And then I went up and asked if she spoke any English or Italian, and she had some English. So I said, look, I don't want to intrude, but I can't help being curious. What has moved you so much? And she told me that her grandfather had been a Greek Catholic priest. Of course, in the Eastern churches, the clergy are able to marry, so her grandfather had been had been a priest. He was arrested during one of the episodic Soviet-era crackdowns and sent off to the gulags. And basically given the choice of you can renounce your loyalty to the Catholic Church and become Orthodox, or we're going to kill you. He refused to renounce his Catholicism. And they were true to their word. He was killed, but not just by putting a bullet in his head. Okay? They actually nailed him to the prison wall and left him to die over an agonizing period of several days. Okay? And this, by the way, this is not the detail of some martyrology from the 2nd century, folks. Okay? This was basically 60 years ago. Okay? So what this young woman told me, the reason she was crying, is because she was imagining what must be in her grandfather's heart, looking down from heaven that day and seeing the Holy Father standing on Ukrainian soil. Now, folks, you have to understand, I grew up in rural western Kansas, okay? And my idea of suffering for the faith was eating fish sticks and mac and cheese on Fridays during Lent. Okay, it's as close as I ever got. Okay? What that young woman brought home to me in a flash, and really in a microcosm, this is the story of the Greek Catholic Church during the Soviet era, what she brought home to me is that there was, beyond all the politics and all the sources of heartache that we all know about the church, okay, beyond all of that, there is something so precious here that ordinary people, when push comes to shove, will pay in blood rather than let it go. Okay? And it's one thing to kind of understand that notionally, it's another thing to have a taste of it experientially, and that's what Ukraine gave me. Okay? one of the reasons I'm such a big supporter of the Greek Catholic University, because as you know, the model of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic University is that it's an enterprise that flies on two wings. Okay, one is the wing of the martyrs, and the other is the wing based on the work of Henry Nouwen, the mentally and physically and emotionally disabled. Anyway, that's a long preface to come to your questions. Why wasn't there a clearer protest from the U.S. Catholic community in 2003? I think the plain reality is that in April 2003, American Catholic opinion was divided. I mean, we're 25% of the American Catholic population, or the American population generally. Okay, so whatever you find in American society generally, you will find in American Catholicism. And at that time, there was a current in the church that was very critical of the war, and there was a current in the church that was very supportive. And I think the bishops at the time, even though if you read their statements, they clearly did not sign off on the war, I think they were not as pointed as they could have been, in part because, like leaders in any other walk of life, it is difficult to get too far out ahead of where your people actually are. Okay. I think it has taken some time, for the realities of that conflict to come more clearly into view. The reason I said there's a legitimate debate is because there still are American Catholics who I deeply respect who would insist that, at least in terms of its intentions, if not necessarily in the execution of it, that this was a legitimate enterprise. Okay. And I'm sorry, I've already forgotten your second question.
What is speculation? What do you think the nuntius?
Oh, the nuntius, how are they going to have to morally compromise? Look, I mean, whenever you are in a situation where your people are getting their teeth kicked in, you have to make a prudential judgment about how much public protest is going to be useful versus how much of it is just going to make things worse. I mean, we know that story from the Soviet era. It's the story of the church in China today. It's the story of the church in many parts of the Middle East and other parts of the globe. My own guess is that a great deal is going to depend upon the personality of individual nuncios, because I do not expect there are going to be strong directives from the Holy See on this question, which will be different than it was, say, during the John Paul era. During the John Paul era, in Russia, for example, there were marching orders from the Secretary of State that said you cannot protest any perceived infringement upon your religious liberty, because the bigger prize here is rapprochement with the Orthodox, and so you can't rock the boat. Actually, the most effective religious voice in Russian society was the lay-edited Catholic newspaper in Moscow, and they actually closed under orders of the Secretary of State, because the line was, if somebody's going to speak to these issues, it should be the Orthodox, it should be the Patriarch of Moscow, not us. And that was a particular diplomatic line. I would not expect that to be the case under this papacy. Again, the big picture here is a certain decentralization under Francis. That is, that not every question has to be answered in Rome. And the application of that is much greater sensitivity to the voice of the local church. So I think it's going to be an intersection of the judgment of the nuncio and the judgment of the local hierarchy, much more so than some template being imposed from Rome. Yes, sir. Sorry.
Yes, sir. I also have two questions. The first of which, when you cited the numbers of countries where you had Christians being persecuted, how much of this is in fact Christian-on-Christian persecution? Example was cited a few minutes ago about Orthodox Christians having been known to persecute Catholic Christians in Russia and other countries. We know that Catholic Christians are discriminated against big time in Ulster by Protestant Christians. We know that if a Catholic is in, darkest Alabama, he might find a little bit of discrimination there. And we certainly know that Salt Lake City is not exactly a welcoming place for Catholic and Protestant Christians. How much of those figures are we Christians doing this sort of mischief to ourselves? Second question. American Catholics represent, as you, I believe, pointed out, 4% of the world's population. 6%, okay. That still makes us a tiny minority. How much is nationalism eventually going to play into this, where not just American Catholics, but Canadian Catholics, UK Catholics, Western Catholics in general are going to feel that, hey, we're getting the short end of the stick here, we're not being heard or we're not being represented. How much tension is that likely to create?
Okay, well, your first question, to what extent is the anti-Christian? Let's talk about violence, because persecution is a slightly fuzzier term. I mean, one person's persecution. We can argue over what that means, but direct physical violence is terribly unambiguous. Okay? Going back to the Gordon Conwell report, the Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell, they've actually done a multi-volume series, History of Martyrdom. I believe the number they cite is something like there have been, I believe it is 8 billion martyrs since the time of Christ, or something like that, of which 2/3 of them came in the 20th century, in the early 21st. And the lion's share of which came during the Soviet era in the portion of the map that was under Soviet control, which means that much of this violence was being suffered by Christians and in many cases being perpetrated by people who at least ostensibly identified themselves as Christians. That is, Russia, for example, is an overwhelmingly Christian society, as is Ukraine, and yet the martyrdom totals from these two countries are just staggering. Now, of course, the leaders of the regime are officially atheists, but many of the people implementing the programs that led to the death of Christians on a vast scale were at least self-described Christians themselves. Further, you look around the map today, there are many places where the violence that we're talking about is Christian on Christian. One of the examples that I like to talk about, another one from Mexico. 4 or 5 years ago, there was a village in rural Mexico. Mexico, like many parts of Latin America, which was once homogeneously Catholic, has seen this explosion of very aggressively missionary Pentecostal and evangelical sects movements. There was a newly established Pentecostal church in this rural Mexican village where a group of traditionalist Catholics basically marched up to the Pentecostal church one day and said, "You all have 48 hours to get out of here, and if you don't, we're going to lynch you." And they, at first, the Pentecostals thought this was a joke. 48 hours later, they see a mob with pitchforks and torches was sitting on the church, and they beat a quick retreat, took refuge in another town, and still have not been able to go back. Now, listen, statistically speaking, in the early 21st century, the single greatest source of violence directed against Christians would be Islamic radicalism. Okay? In percentage terms, the greatest manufacturer of anti-Christian violence would be Hindu radicalism. Christians are fairly far down the list, but we don't get a get-out-of-jail-free card. We are responsible for it, too. And I'm sorry, your second question?
My second question was with us in the United States.
Oh, nationalism.
Very shortly, how much is nationalism going to?
Well, look, I know that American Catholics like to complain sometimes, certain kinds of American Catholics anyway, like to complain that Rome doesn't listen to us enough, or we don't get enough love from the Vatican and stuff like that. And there may be some merit to those perceptions from time to time. But look, folks, I'll tell you, the way the rest of the world sees it is we already get far too much love from Rome. Okay, let's start with this. The conclave of 2013 that elected Cardinal Bergoglio as Pope Francis. So, geographically speaking, the single largest voting bloc was the Italians. The second largest voting bloc was the Americans. We had 13 cardinals that voted in that conclave. All of Africa had the same number, 13. There's 3 times the Catholic population in Africa as there is in the United States. Or, even a more clear example, we had 4 more cardinals who cast votes in that conclave than Brazil and Mexico combined, the 2 largest Catholic countries on earth. Okay? Roughly 112 million Catholics in Brazil, at least in terms of the baptism totals, and 90-some million in Mexico. Okay? So that's 200 million as opposed to our 67 million. We outvoted them 13-9. Okay? And that's just to talk about the College of Cardinals. We could give plenty of other examples. Okay? We are the only Catholic country in the world where we have at least one American, to my knowledge, working in every dicastery of the Holy See other than Italy. Okay, this is a standard thing that every dicastery has to have one Italian and one American. And then after that, you fill your slots, catch as catch can. Right? Look, is it going to be the case, perhaps, that as the 21st century unfolds, the American voice will count for slightly less in the Holy See than it has, say, for the last 50 years? That the number of American cardinals relative to cardinals from other parts of the world, the number of Americans in decision-making positions relative to other parts of the world, the basic throw weight of the American Bishops' Conference with respect to other conferences, that all of that may go into decline slightly? Yeah, I think it very well may. Now, we're certainly not going to disappear. We are going to continue to be a very important force in global Catholic life, make no mistake. I think it is true, probably, that Catholic cultures from other points of the globe are going to become, proportionately speaking, somewhat more important, which by definition means we are going to become slightly less influential in terms of moving the levers of power in the global church. Will that irritate some Americans? Possibly. I think many people from other parts of the world would say it is a long overdue measure of equilibrium.
Thank you for being here tonight. I'm Catholic, so I'm going to be careful how I ask this, but I am from I am from Kansas, so I hope that
then we got that.
it makes up for that.
Whereabouts?
Wichita.
Well, that's not really Kansas. But go on.
Well, it's the city.
Yeah.
Anyway, you said to the last questioner that violence is terribly unambiguous. But the roots and the rationale for violence is not terribly unambiguous. I hear you when you say, when you talk about the severity of persecution. I hear that, and I think you're absolutely right to call attention to it. What I did not hear tonight, however, is any sense of to what degree we Christians are responsible for that. And I don't mean quite what the last questioner did. But for example, you said tearing the lids off of tension in Iraq. Pre-existing tension, that was the word you used, rather than creating new tension. We had two presidents, the last two presidents, who publicly professed Jesus as Savior, who then rained down or authorized the raining down of cluster munitions, of unmanned aerial vehicle munitions, of special op forces. Those are the things geopolitically on the ground today that are creating the most dissension. I'm wondering to what degree before we start moving strongly to resist persecution head on, we as Christians need to take account of the degree to which we are perpetrators of that indirectly, the degree to which indirectly we are victimizing each other.
That's an excellent question. And I would say we need to do both things at once. I mean, first of all, when somebody is being brutalized, I don't really care what geopolitical rationale someone uses to justify it. I just want the brutality to stop, and I want us to do whatever we can to bring that about. Now, that does not excuse us from asking the higher order questions that you pose, which is, are there ways in which we Americans or we in the West are engaging with the rest of the world that are fomenting a kind of hostility? And is there a need for a kind of different way of trying to advance our national and geopolitical interests that would be less likely, less conducive to produce this kind of hostility? So I think both things need to happen. But frankly, my concern, I thought where you were going to go with this question was somewhat different, which is, how do we know that what I'm talking about is actually anti-Christian violence? Because, what many critics would say, all of those people who have been killed in Iraq, for example, even if they're disproportionately Christian, they would say they're really victims of anti-Western anger, as opposed to, the traditional test of martyrdom, which in the Catholic Church is someone being killed in odium fidei, in hatred of the faith. Or, all of those victims in Congo, you would say, those people are not being killed for explicitly religious reasons. And so it's tragic and it's shocking, yes, but is it really anti-Christian violence? That's actually the question I thought you were going to set up. And let me just very quickly, although you did not ask me that question, I am infamous for answering questions I've never been asked. So let me just very quickly address that, because it is something that I think is important. There is this sort of mythology out there that something counts as anti-Christian, if something counts as martyrdom, something counts as anti-Christian persecution, only if the motives are explicitly religious. Let me try to tell you a story that I think punctures that myth. Two of the new martyrs of 2012 for the Catholic Church, a Croatian sister by the name of Lucretia Mamic, and an Italian lay volunteer by the name of Francesco Barzani. They were in Burundi, in a region of Burundi that was the epicenter of the genocide in 1994. It is also, according to the UN HIV/AIDS Project, the lone spot on the map where the rate of HIV infection is the highest in the world, is in this particular region of Burundi. Now, what happened last year is that a group of basically thieves broke into the convent. Not because they had any hatred for nuns or Catholics or anything. They broke into the convent because they thought it would be a good place to steal stuff. They shot Sister Mamic the moment she opened the door, so she was dead from the get-go. They then kidnapped Barzani, the lay volunteer from Italy, put him in their car. They got involved in a high-speed chase with the police. They eventually pulled out to the side of the road to engage in a gun battle, and they shot them in the middle of this because they were afraid So at one level you could say, tragic, heartrending, yes, but not really martyrdom, not really anti-Christian persecution, because these guys were not looking to kill Christians. However, I think we need to ask a deeper question. And the deeper question is, what were Sister Mamish and Barzani doing there in the first place? I mean, these were smart, cosmopolitan people. They knew there were safer pieces of real estate on the planet. Okay? They were there because they felt their faith called them to stand with the most abandoned, marginalized, and forgotten people on the face of the planet. Their motives for being there were palpably, tangibly, unambiguously religious and faith-filled. So to put this point to you in a soundbite, okay, I'm not so much talking about the theology of canonization and how the church was about the formal process of identifying martyrs, but in terms of counting for our purposes as suffering Christians around the world, I would suggest to you that our standard should not be what was in the head of the guy pulling the trigger. It ought to be what was in the heart of the person getting shot. And if we make that the standard, then I think we have a whole different set of glasses for looking at the world around us. Yes, sir?
I don't buy that argument, but I don't want to answer that question. I want to go back to what was being pursued here with another, maybe another angle. I feel a little wary of religious freedom being made a cause. Not that I'm not for it. Especially in an American context. Because we Americans, especially we American Catholics, think we already have the solution, which is the separation of church and state. And it's a governmental solution of living in a government of the kind that's articulated in Dignitatis Humanae under the influence of Murray, John Carter Murray, who was a good American Catholic. And I think a lot of us think like that. And it I think, becomes problematic, especially in relation to what you said about the great part of your talk about Christians in Iraq and Catholics at the beginning of the 21st century need to repent from. But the people that will look at this horrendous landscape that you're talking about, and that you've nicely depicted for us, and say, here's what to do. We need to bring democracy to those parts of the world. Because as I know you now, there's a lot of people who take up religious liberty as the cause and then say regime change, softer heart, is the solution. I think that this is obviously the case with the neocons, many of whom I respect too. But I also think that more subtly it is with the, quote, other camp. If there is only one other camp, it's the liberals. And I just don't know if we can, I'm wary of bringing on the freight of our Americanist ideology, which we Catholics have been very good at, along with this issue. And I'm saying that without a solution, but I just want to elicit a comment on you about that.
Sure. Well, I mean, first of all, I think the good news, based upon what I said earlier, is that American instincts on these matters, in terms of shaping the policies of the global church, are going to be increasingly less relevant as this century plays itself out. But let me, I'm sorry, you wanted to say something else?
No, I was...
So, I mean, I don't think it is going to be the American way of sizing these issues up that is going to drive the train at the level of the global church, at least. And I certainly think your point about how our sort of default setting, which is usually regime change by hook or by crook, that is, we see a state in which religious freedom is being threatened in some way, and our immediate instinct is that what we need is a change of government in order to bring about a new world. I think that clearly is not an instinct that is shared in many other parts of the Catholic world. I mean, one other thing that I have certainly learned from talking to Christians in Syria in recent months, for example, is that they are extremely skeptical about what they see as, in this case, they would blame it more on the French than us, but in any event, what they see is a Western effort to promote regime change in Syria. Because bear in mind that from their point of view, from the experience of the Christians in Syria, the choice that they perceive is not between a police state and a vibrant democracy. Okay, the choice they perceive is between a police state and annihilation. And in that calculus, it is not that hard to understand why their preference, therefore, is for the police state. So this notion that simply by decapitating the Assad government, you somehow are going to solve all the problems, they would tell you not only is that conceptually suspect, but it flies in the face of recent experience in Iraq, where the same solution was tried. And there's no particular reason to think that the aftermath would be dramatically different in Syria than it was in Iraq. So, look, I think those are the kinds of voices that are going to be increasingly important in terms of setting the sort of diplomatic and geopolitical agenda for the Holy See. I do not think that the Vatican's diplomatic agenda, particularly under this Pope, is going to be shaped primarily by what everyone thinks of them, either neocons or progressives from the United States. I think there will be voices in the mix. I do not think they will be the engine driving the train.
I would like to thank you for your excellent talk.
I would like to thank you for your taste in oratory.
I'm a family physician, and I would just like to share some thoughts. I'm also a part-time graduate student at Loyola University in Student Pastoral Studies. And as a woman and as a physician, I think some of our problems in the States and on religious freedom in the Catholic Church are created by the hierarchy. And I do believe that the main problem in contraception is the fact, there are two different groups whose rights need to be respected. I mean, the rights of the bishops, even though as a Catholic woman, I don't feel like they're speaking for us women in regard to contraception, but the rights of the women too. And so it's a case that if we did not have employer-controlled health care, women would be able to have their rights satisfied, and the bishops would be able to have their desires satisfied. So that's a problem in our country, because women deserve the right to have the health care that they need in deciding with their physician, rather than deciding with their employer what kind of health care they can have. So that's one problem we have in the States. Also, I do feel, and I happen to do some research on feminine spirituality, and it dawned on me, and it dawned, or the Jesuit teaching the class refreshingly said, nearly all the information we have is from one point of view. Our history, our church information is from a man's point of view. And I do feel like a woman's point of view is important too, because women tend to be holistic, and it seems to me, well, what I like about Jesuit spirituality is that it's holistic as well. And St. Ignatius was interested in an inclusiveness, and I feel like under Pope Benedict it's been very exclusive. And the more we get into an inclusive type of mentality, the better. And then if we did, then, I went to medical school at Trinity College in Dublin in Ireland, and I was very much aware of what was going on with Catholics and Protestants killing one another in the north of Ireland. And then I was in England for a few years of training, and I couldn't believe how wonderful the Protestants are. And I thought, gee, they're so much better than me in many respects. And they had a wonderful foundation to Scripture, and growing up as an Irish Catholic with parents from Ireland, we kneeled down saying the family rosary every night, but it angered me to think that my church didn't trust us lay people enough to let us read the Bible, So there's these different things that as Catholics, as Christians, as Protestants, we shouldn't be fighting each other, but we also, like Pope Francis is saying, we have to look out to the world and not be so,
Self-referential.
so just, yeah, that's right. And also, we didn't bring up today, but I've been very involved in the sexual abuse crisis, and I've met many who have been sexually abused by priests. I myself was sexually assaulted by a Carmelite priest when I was a young doctor in Dublin, and the Archbishop of Dublin, Dermot Martin, made that Carmelite priest accountable. And what's been sad to me is so much money through the American hierarchy is going to protect the predator priests in court, not to give money for pastoral care for the victims. And it's throughout the world, sexual abuse, and it's the leadership of the church that has allowed that to happen. And if we don't evangelize our hierarchy, there's no point in trying to evangelize the world. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Well, there's a great deal there to pick up on, and I can't in any way give a comprehensive commentary or answer to it. But let me just pick up on a couple of things that struck me as you were speaking. First, I mean, by no means do I want to let the bishops off the hook for anything. I mean, frankly, as a journalist, I sort of feed on the fact that complaining about the hierarchy is the favorite indoor sport in Roman Catholicism. But I will say this, I think sometimes in Catholic life we have an epidemic of treating people on the basis of class membership rather than as individuals. That is, we talk about the bishops and the laity and American nuns and young priests these days. And, you know, inevitably, if you actually know the people in any of these groups, you know, it's a much more complicated picture than these stereotypes would suggest. I mean, you know, in the United States, we've got 189 diocesan ordinaries. By the time you add in the auxiliaries, you get to 230. By the time you add in the emeriti, that is the retired guys, you get to more than 300. I mean, it's a complex group. And believe me, you know, on whether it's the contraception issue or anything else, there is diversity in that group. Given that, whether we're talking about the Vatican or the bishops or whatever, I mean, my usual rule of thumb for Catholic life is we can either make sweeping generalizations about where people come from and therefore assume that they are all destined to be the problem, or we can identify people in each of these constituencies with whom we have shared values and a kind of shared view of things and try to establish constructive relationships. And choice is yours, but it usually seems to me that second choice is the more constructive use of our time and energy. The thing is, you talked about the importance of listening to the voice of women. Believe me, as a guy who's getting ready to celebrate his 20th wedding anniversary, this is something that is near and dear to my heart, because most of what I know about the world that is useful has been taught to me by my wife. And in particular, you know, we were talking earlier about my view about how friendship is the magic bullet to overcome tribalization. My wife is really the one who taught me that. Not necessarily setting out to, but she did, and here's why. My wife, well, first of all, you should know my wife, Shannon, is not Catholic, she's Jewish, and she's the sort of liberal feminist type of Jew. In fact, I like to say that my wife is the founder of the fourth strain of American Judaism that I call Obama Messianism. She's not waiting for the Savior next year in Jerusalem, baby. As far as she's concerned, he's on the job, you know. Now, to make sense of this, you need to know that back in 2005, I did a book about Opus Dei, okay? Which stereotypically, in terms of the Catholic imagination, is seen as fairly conservative, right? You can imagine what my liberal Jewish feminist wife thought about the idea of spending a year and a half living with doing a book on Opus Dei, okay? Let me just give you a sense of where she comes from. When we moved back from Rome, after a brief interlude in New York, she settled us in Denver, in Colorado. Now, Colorado is both a red and a blue state politically, but you certainly wouldn't know that from the sort of chic liberal enclave she plunked us down in Stapleton, in Denver, which is the ultimate in sort of Prius-driving, Birkenstock-wearing, squale-saving, you know, sort of liberal fashion sense. There's this little vegetarian eatery she drags me to when I'm in town every Saturday morning for breakfast. And folks, if secular liberalism had a chapel, okay, this is where they would go to worship, okay? I swear to God. The way I amuse myself is when she drags me there on a Saturday morning, I'll sit there at the table and have the little granola French toast or whatever that I'm supposed to be having. But in a loud enough voice for everyone to hear, I'll say things to her like, Shannon, you know who gets a bad rap? You know who's a really misunderstood guy? Dick Cheney. There's a guy. But we need to take more time. The last time I tried this, she looked at me and said, next Saturday, why don't you bring your white sheet and burning cross? That's my wife. Okay, so this book on Opus Dei. My idea for the book was I wanted to go to 9 different countries in various parts of the world because I wanted to see Opus Dei on the ground, right? So we went to Kenya, and we went to Peru, and we went to Spain, obviously, the UK, Russia, a couple of places I'm forgetting. But anyway, it was kind of a global tour. And the idea was that everywhere we landed, I wanted to see 3 groups. I wanted to see the Opus Dei people, I wanted to see the critics, and I wanted to just see ordinary people to see what they thought about it, okay? However, the logistics were almost inevitably handled by the Opus Dei folks because, you know, if you need somebody to pick you up at the airport and get you to your hotel or whatever, I mean, they kind of have people who will do that. So, when we would land in all of these, and my wife made all these trips with me, because this was back when travel still struck her as, you know, adventurous and romantic. We would land, and then I would go off and do journalism, and she would go off and play tours, okay? And inevitably, the people she was being shown around by were usually these young, smart, hip, funny, talented Opus Dei women. Okay? It's 20-something, 30-something numeraries in various countries, okay? And she was just endlessly, I mean, she's still Facebook friends with a lot of these people and so on, right? And I could tell this was eating her up. And I remember we got back to our hotel in Nairobi one night. This was halfway through the project. And she was in agony. So I said to her, Shannon, you know, what's wrong? What's bothering you? And she said, man, politically, I know I should hate these people, but they're just so damn nice. You know? And now, the funny thing is that, you know, whenever we are in Catholic environments, and of course, you know, she, being the nice Jewish girl that she is, knows more about the Catholic Church than 99% of the Catholics on the planet. But whenever we're in Catholic circles, and the question of Opus Dei comes up, she actually is the one who will step up and say things like, yeah, I don't like their politics either, but you don't know these people, and I do. Let me tell you what they're really all about. Now, my point, it was not some rational argument that brought her to a position where she was willing to take a more sympathetic look at this group. It was the experience of becoming friends with them. Okay, and in microcosm, I think that's the answer to the tribalization I was just trying to describe earlier. My point, that and every other valuable life lesson I carry around with me basically is thanks to my wife. So if there's a petition being circulated about the importance of listening to the voice of the women, pencil me in as signature number 1. Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here. God bless. I just happened to stop in on the spur of the moment. And it's interesting, we're here under the auspices of DePaul University. St. Vincent de Paul said that unless you are burning with love, others will die of the cold. And what you said about those people that were butchered in that church, I read about it, I studied it, it tore me apart. I'm just trembling even thinking about it, what happened to those people in that church and what you said about that young girl. And the Vatican sent a cardinal on a desperate attempt to stop the war. He went to see George Bush. He was a close friend of the Bush family. The Pope sent him. Yeah. And Bush listened to him politely and just ignored him. The Pope was against this war. And 2 very great Americans in the media, who are my idols, spoke out continuously and strongly. One was our own Father Greeley, who's my idol, and the other was the late Molly Ivins. They spoke out for what this war is. Almost nothing was done as far as the hierarchy in this country to speak up against this horror, this evil. And I've read a great deal, and I relating to this subject, and I think of people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Germany, another one of my idols, spoke up and was murdered by the Nazis. Archbishop Romero, who spoke up against what the right wing was doing with the support of America in the Middle East. And of course, in the 60s, we had the Berrigan brothers, God bless them. Daniel Berrigan is still living in New York. He's working with AIDS people, AIDS patients. Where are the Berrigan brothers today? Where are they? I mean, there's none. Where are they? Where are the people speaking up against this war? I was at St. Peter's downtown, and just after the war started, about a year after, and this man stood up and asked the priest on the altar in front of a crowded church, why hasn't the church spoken up against this? And the priest made a feeble argument that, well, we were there actually to protect the Christians. We're helping them. And then I wanted to get up and scream. And just what you said about what is happening, this specific incident you described in that church where they were butchered mercilessly, I've thought about that often, and I've had to put that in context of perspective because it was just driving me not nuts, but it disturbed me that the Catholic Church, even today, for example, His Eminence is on TV denouncing gay marriage, and people are being butchered in the streets with the gun violence, and the church is all for, against, well, of course, they have to take a stance on abortion and against what they feel is gay marriage or gays adopting children, but there's not a word from them. They have a serious case of lockjaw when it comes to the gun violence in this country, with people being butchered, and especially Chicago. I don't want to. I was thinking of a line. It was on the tomb of Jonathan Swift, who stood up against the Irish being persecuted and by the British. And it says, "Here lies Jonathan Swift, where savage indignation can no longer lacerate his heart." Why isn't there more savage indignation in this country? About now there's talk of another war in the Middle East. The wars have drained our country, where people have been laid off. There's hundreds of thousands of people, teachers, everyone. I mean, I'm starting to pontificate here, but again, your story about the people in the church encapsulates everything. This was discussed in the media, and it was dropped like a hot potato. Nobody talked about it, but it burned into my soul. What happened?
Well, first of all, we're talking about the Vatican here tonight, so you're perfectly free to pontificate. We're licensed to pontificate. Thank you for sharing your views on that, and obviously that was less a question than a comment, but I will say your point about John Paul's opposition to the war. I'm of the view that John Paul II, in the fullness of time, will probably go down as John Paul the Great, but not always for the same reasons that some others think so, and I think one of them is precisely his witness against the war in 2003. And I say this because you will remember in the run-up to that war, the great fear in many circles is that this was going to be the thing that ignited the clash of civilizations, right? That it was going to ignite a broader conflict between the Islamic world and the West, and that we would see many versions of the Iraq war all across the map. And of course, in the main, it didn't really happen. Now, in the period, both immediately before and after the U.S. invasion, I had set up lines of communication with people who were involved in Christian-Muslim dialogue in various parts of the world. So in Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, and other places, about 8 or 9 different countries. And the striking thing, when I asked them, after the invasion began, what impact had it had on Christian-Muslim relations in their own backyard, most of them told me that although there was great anger in the Islamic street in their neighborhoods about the invasion, for the most part, people had not generalized that to a broader sort of anger with Christianity, and in part it was because of John Paul's witness against the war, which had enormous coverage in the Arab language media, and not so much here perhaps, but in many other parts of the world. It had an enormous media resonance. I'm profoundly convinced that in 2003, John Paul's witness during that period was a key ingredient in preventing that war from becoming the kickstart, that is, the launch to a much broader wave of violence. And so I do think that will be part of the story of John Paul. And by the way, if you want to see this documented in great detail, you should read Andrea Riccardi's biography of the Pope, which came out at the time of his beatification in 2010, because it'll give you chapter and verse. Yes.
Thanks for your presentation. My question concerns ecumenism and I suppose diverse missiologies in relation to what you have related, the persecution of Christians. The fact that the Patriarch Bartholomew attended the papal installation and other leaders of other Christian traditions were there. The prospect of some more cooperation with the Orthodox, and what role might that play in defending Christians? And then diverse missiologies. I'm remembering that Orissa State, there was some fundamentalist Christians, and I remember one missionary of maybe Baptist or evangelical. I remember his van was torched and whatnot. But there are diverse missiologies, some going in, and I guess unless you accept Jesus Christ, you're not saved. I haven't been to India, but versus how Vatican II renewed a Catholic attitude to the world religions. There's a more nuanced approach. Does any of that have a bearing on what you have?
Oh, sure, it does. I mean, listen, there is no doubt that there are times in which Christians in various parts of the world engage in a kind of aggressive proselytism that is almost deliberately provocative. I mean, there's a famous story, for example, about Filipino Pentecostal missionaries in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, okay, who went around in some of the wealthier neighborhoods in Riyadh, where they, middle class and above, have these walled compounds, okay, and they were walking down the street, literally tossing Bibles over the walls, which in a number of cases hit people on the head. So we were literally beating people over the head with the Bible, okay? And that created you can imagine what the Islamic fundamentalist press in Saudi Arabia did with that, and it created a kind of wave of backlash that made life even more difficult than it ordinarily. So, I mean, look, there's no doubt that sometimes we Christians will make boneheaded choices that make the situation worse. That said, I do think the ability to freely propose one's faith is a piece of what religious freedom means. And further, to go back to what I said earlier, yes, we need to constantly be evaluating the choices we make in terms of American citizens and our foreign policy, and whether that is making the world more dangerous for Christians. Our choices in terms of missionary strategy, how we engage the other religions of the world and the other Christian churches. Yes, we need to constantly be asking those questions. But at the end of the day, that still is no excuse for physical brutality directed against innocent parties, and we need to do what we can to try to impede it. Okay. Now, last thing about ecumenism. I do believe that the momentum from religious freedom, and particularly the defense of suffering Christians around the world, is a quintessentially ecumenical enterprise, and it opens the door to obvious cooperation on multiple fronts. I mean, and it's not just ecumenical in the sense of relations among the Christian churches, but it's also interfaith, okay, because the mainstream leaders of all the different religions have an interest in trying to promote a global atmosphere of robust respect for religious freedom. I think in part that's what Benedict XVI had in mind when he talked about shifting from specifically interreligious to intercultural dialogue. That is, putting the emphasis not on differing soteriologies in Islam and Christianity, but where Muslims, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, and so forth can do business together in terms of their shared humanitarian values, and this would obviously be at the top of the list. We getting close?
I'm just aware of the time, and I don't want to try your patience too much and have mercy on you. So maybe we can just make these last three questions be the last three questions. The fish sticks and the mac and cheese.
Oh, wait. Oh, yeah.
Thank you also for your talk tonight. I hope my question isn't too far left field, but since about the same time as the HHS issue with religious liberty in the United States, the National Labor Relations Board has been going through different Catholic universities, administrative hearings, ruling that they are, quote, operating as secular institutions and cannot claim exemptions from certain laws, discrimination, hiring, and unionization mainly. And I'm wondering if you have any commentary on that issue or at all.
Honestly, no. I mean, I'm aware of the issue, but since my gig is sort of the Vatican and the global church, I try as much as possible to stay out of a tight focus on the American domestic situation, except when I get sucked in through a back door. So I don't have much intelligent to say about that, except that it's an example of the point I made earlier, which is that the church-state tensions that we face here are hardly exhausted by the debate over contraception mandates. And while I think there is hope that reasonable people on both sides of these debates, these tensions, can find accommodations, I think both the quantity of the tensions and the intensity of those tensions is likely to accelerate. And therefore, I think that one of the key issues probably that the leadership of the Catholic Church in the United States is going to face, well, one is going to be twofold. First, how is the hierarchy in this country going to position itself with respect to engaging these tensions? And secondly, who are they going to choose as their allies in trying to fight these fights? Because let's face it, one of the things that's true of American politics is there's a sort of industry out there of hysteria generation. Okay, in all different circles and all different points of view, there are all these groups out there. Okay, groups that set up, to protect the rights of particular constituencies, think tanks, advocacy groups, policy institutes, and so on. And they are financially dependent upon keeping their constituents in a state of perpetual hysteria because mad people will sign checks. Okay? So I think the leaders of any mainstream institutions, whether we're talking about the Catholic Church or anybody else, we got to be careful and exercise prudential judgment about who we want to partner with in trying to pursue some of these questions, because there are some groups that genuinely want to find middle ground and want cooler heads to prevail, and there are others for whom it is not in their financial interest for that to happen. We got to be careful about not only who do we pick to fight against, who do we pick to fight with. Yes.
I'm actually a journalism major, television journalism.
God bless you.
And a lot of what I hear and everyone hears in the media is the big issues about gay marriage in the church and women's rights in the church. And although those are very important, that's a very North American attitude that's much most common in North America. And clearly there's so many other very pressing issues around the rest of the world that the Vatican is very concerned with. To those people who are very centered around that North American attitude and really concentrated on the other issues, what would you say to them to kind of bring light the situation that the Catholic world is actually in around the world from the Vatican's perspective?
Well, I think, first of all, I think debates about the role of women in the church, for example, or about sexual ethics are perfectly legitimate. I mean, beyond legitimate. I mean, these are very important topics, and people feel passionately about them, on all sides of these questions. I don't think there's anything wrong with talking about them, but I think your fundamental intuition is quite right. That if you go into sub-Saharan Africa, for example, or you go onto the Indian subcontinent, and you find rank-and-file Catholics from those parts of the world, if you ask them for their opinion about, say, contraception, or about gay marriage, or about women in the church, they will certainly have opinions, and they will be, in some ways, as spread out as ours are. But if you ask them what their priorities are, that typically is not where they're going to begin. Okay, they're going to begin on other things. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, oddly enough, when you ask people what they believe the church's top social justice priority ought to be, if you did a poll average, probably the thing that would finish in the top three, if not outright number one, would be the struggle against corruption. The truth of it is that we could fund the UN Millennium Goals 4 times over. We could implement the Tobin tax tomorrow. We could triple or quadruple the foreign aid budgets of Western governments. And that would not put a dent in endemic poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, which, according to the Transparency Institute, siphons about $1.3 trillion out of African development every year. And of course, they would argue that part of the reason that this corruption is perpetuated is because Western governments, and in particular Western business interests, often find it more congenial to do business with corrupt regimes rather than to promote serious reform. Okay? So my point, that's where Catholic energy often is directed. I mean, if you go to the Peace and Justice Commissions, for example, of African Bishops' Conference, you will often find that their top priority, where their time and treasure is invested, is not only trying to fight corruption at the policy level, but also at the level of education, that is trying to work in Catholic schools to raise a new generation of leaders who will be more interested in thinking about the common good than lining their own pockets and that of their political allies and kin groups, and so on. So, you ask, what would you say to people who seem to be kind of myopically obsessed with that small canon of issues that we talk about all the time in the church? First, there's nothing wrong with talking about those issues. They are important, they need to be aired, although you should do it with an understanding that there's a much wider range of opinion in the church than you may think when you actually start listening to people. But that said, I think it's also healthy to remind them that these are not necessarily the priorities of Catholics in many other parts of the world. And if we mean what we say about being a global family of faith, then part of what that means is that sometimes our own sense of priorities need to yield to the perceived priorities of people in other parts of the world, particularly people who have really not been heard either by the church or the world in a meaningful fashion for an awful long time.
Thank you. I'm a neighbor on the laity, and I appreciate you sharing the insights, and I'm going to ask a couple questions. journalism. And thank you for letting us have this forum to air frustration. It seems like there's a lot of venting going on. So this is my vent.
Vent away.
Okay. I'm sorry to say I don't get the Catholic Reporter. So my source of news happens to be the secular news. So
It's okay, I work there too. It's all good.
So I have a couple questions. My family hears about this all the time. It's the media. It's the whole media. So a couple of questions surrounding that. At the conclave, which is in Rome, while you were covering that, the first, I was getting excited that finally the Catholic Church is on the front page. But the first thing is that in the first paragraph, it's like, oh boy, maybe they'll look at ordaining women. This was like the first paragraph of covering this new change in the Vatican.
Just for the record, it was not my first paragraph.
And then there was another one last weekend about a conference on stem cell. Ooh, it must be something new to the Vatican. They probably don't know how to spell stem cell. They bring these scientists in for a conference to listen. Ooh, I bet they're going to pass embryonic stem cell research reforms or something. But as we know, Father Tad is who I'm familiar with, bioethics has been telling for years about adult stem cells.
Yeah, this was actually a conference promoted by the Pontifical Council for Culture and Adult Stem Cell Research.
Yes, but the press kind of biased it, or the article that I read, Wall Street Journal, kind of biased it to say, oh, embryonic, they
Fortunately, I'm embarrassed to tell you that the guy who was the Rome correspondent for the Wall Street Journal was a guy to whom I was his journalism teacher in high school. So if you got issues with this article, in a roundabout fashion, it's my fault. So, may it hold.
And that's where I'm going is, I was educated on to think out more outside of the whole North American viewpoint by my pastor. The advertising think on this to say, well, the Pope has a lot more to worry about than ordaining women or whatnot in the worldview. When he said that to me and to us, a forum, 10, 12 years ago, it really opened my eyes. And you're reinforcing that. So I've had 12 years to kind of keep an eye out for that, but the media still, of course, they're writing to North American audiences. I'm wondering what percentage of the American media is aware that there's more to the Vatican's worldview than just contraception, pro-life, pro-choice, gay marriage.
Yeah. Look, I mean, let me say this about, because what you're really asking is about media coverage of the church, and why does it tend to so often be focused on a very narrow list of issues when there's a much bigger story to tell. My basic observation is that the fundamental problem with regard to the media's coverage of the church, of religion generally, and the Catholic Church in particular, and the Vatican in particular, the fundamental problem is not explicit bias. I mean, I could give you a few individual cases of it out of my own experience, of people who have an axe to grind to the church, but the fundamental problem is not bias. The fundamental problem is illiteracy, ignorance. I mean, in the media, we simply do not invest the resources in covering religion that we do in most other news feeds. I mean, for us, politics, finance, even sports and entertainment, okay, these are daily news feeds. Religion is at best an occasional news feed. So you've got an enormously complicated beat that is being covered by part-timers, by amateurs, who simply, not that these are dumb people, they simply do not have the time and the track record to be able to develop the kind of deep understanding that you need to really do justice to the subject. Okay? I mean, I've often found myself in the position of being kind of a mentor to freshly arrived English-speaking journalists in Rome who have come over to cover the Vatican. Classic case in point, 2001. The Vatican puts out this document called Dominus Jesus, okay, which was a document about the relationship between Christianity and the other great religions of the world, and kicked up some dust because there was this line in the document that said that, objectively speaking, non-Christians are in a gravely deficient position with respect to salvation, which some people thought was insensitive to those religions, and it was a controversial document, all right? At the press conference to present it, the main presenter was then Cardinal Ratzinger, of course, went on to become Pope Benedict. Sitting next to me at this press conference was the newly arrived New York Times correspondent in Rome, whose last job had been covering the State House in Albany. And at one stage in this presser, Ratzinger starts talking about the differences between Jesuit and Dominican views of grace in the 16th century. This guy got that classic deer caught in the headlight expression where you could just hear him think, dear God, what am I going to do with this? And And I had to spend 20 minutes afterwards sort of like translating that into, the language of the street. My point is that it is completely unreasonable. And this is a very talented journalist, has gone on to do a number of very impressive things with his career, but it's completely unrealistic to expect a guy like that to just rush in and sort of make sense of things. I would say if you want to cover the Vatican, you got to speak 3 languages. Okay? First of all is Italian, because it's the working language of the place. The Vatican is actually the most stubbornly monolingual environment on earth, ladies and gentlemen. When I got there, I thought it was going to be like the UN, everything would be multilingual and simultaneous translation. No, absolutely everything is in Italian. And I'm a classic case of how it's important to learn the language, because I didn't have any, when I got to Rome, my Italian was so bad, I thought prego was a kind of spaghetti sauce. Okay? That's where I was. So I had to master that language. Secondly, you got to speak the language of the Catholic Church. You got to know a little theology and church history and scripture and liturgy and canon law, because if you don't, you're just going to be completely ignorant. And then third, you got to speak the language of the Vatican itself. So, you got to know the difference between a congregation and a council. Okay, you have to know the difference between an undersecretary and a deputy de labor. Okay, you got to know the difference between a motu proprio and an apostolic exhortation. Okay. Now, the good news is that none of this is rocket science. Okay, you can figure it out. My point is, most people doing this coverage simply do not have the time, they don't have the opportunity, and there's nothing in the system that encourages them to develop that kind of fluency. So, we're in a buyer beware environment. Now, and by the way, let me just say, I was just talking about the media's problems in engaging the church. We could just as easily talk about the church's problems in engaging the media. Frankly, I think if somebody wanted to write a graduate thesis on how not to craft a communication strategy, they could study the Holy See and come up with a pretty impressive piece of work, much of the time. Okay, so the problems exist on both sides, and in many ways it's a perfect storm. Okay, I wish I could tell you that the new Jerusalem is about to arrive, and suddenly the American media is going to have this metanoia, this sort of kairos moment in which we realize that we need to invest a much greater level of resources and develop the professional expertise to do this story right. Unfortunately, I can't tell you that because there have been various moments in my life when I thought we were on the cusp of it happening. And it didn't. 2005 is a classic example. The death of John Paul, those 5 to 10 million people who rushed through Rome, the incredible saturation coverage in the global media. I remember I was on the roof of the Urban College, which was the CNN location for all of that. Back then, Aaron Brown was the guy who hosted CNN's main primetime news program, Newsnight with Aaron Brown. So we were on the air every night from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the morning Rome time, because that's prime time in the States. And I remember one of those nights, we came off air. Aaron and I are both smokers, fellow members of the Fraternity of the Damned. And so we were up there on the roof, having a smoke. Aaron, you have to understand, is a tribal Jew, all right? There's not a religious bone in his body, okay? Classic sort of, secular, somewhat cynical, journalistic view of life. But we were standing there on the roof, watching this incredibly prayerful crowd down in the square. Okay, these hauntingly beautiful hymns, the Te Deum and so forth, playing over and over again in the loudspeakers. There was a kind of palpable prayerfulness about that I can't really explain, but I can tell you it was thick enough you could slice it and bottle it. And Aaron looked at me and said, there's something about this whole religion thing I just don't get. He said, but because of this experience, I know that I need to get it. Okay, and so I thought that was going to be the beginning. And so for CNN after that, we hired a faith and values correspondent whose whole beat was supposed to be to develop this, which lasted about 6 months, and then they forgot about it. We've gone through cycles, my point is. I thought after 9/11, if you ever needed proof positive that religion is a driving force in human affairs, how about that? Right? And again, there was a brief period in which there was a kind of new commitment that we need to understand how religion motivates people for good or ill, and it kind of, pardon the Catholic language, kind of petered out. And so I can't promise you, okay, that any time soon we're going to be living in a new media environment in which the coverage is better than you described it. Given that, I think there are only 2 conclusions. One, we all have to be careful consumers of church news. Okay, religion news generally. You have to know where you can go to find good stuff and what to avoid. I I wish the product were uniformly impeccable, but it's not. You're going to have to make careful decisions for yourself about which sources of news that you find helpful and reliable. Okay. The other point is that all those of us who in various ways are involved in communications either about or on behalf of the church, we need to understand that we cannot sit around and wait for the media to sort of meet us halfway. Okay, we've got to go out and engage them. Whether what we're trying to do is simply promote greater literacy about the church, which is my aim, a fairly low-level aim, or whether you're actually trying to evangelize, which is a much higher level aim on behalf of the faith. But in any event, if you're sitting around thinking that there's going to be a change in the media climate that's going to make that easier, it's not going to happen, and therefore, at least in any short-term future that I can conjure up. And so therefore, it seems to me the obligation has to be on our side of the equation to become much more imaginative and creative and effective in the ways we go about them. Okay. One last thing before I go, which is I want to give you an invitation. I don't want it to sort of parachute in here and then be gone and have no further contact. I want this to be the beginning of the conversation among us rather than the end. So let me give you this invitation. If there is ever any way I can be of help to anyone in this room, I would be delighted and honored to do that. Now, I don't actually have any earthly idea what that means, but if you're in a class and a question comes up about the church in some part of the world, and you think I might be able to give you a contact, or in your parish, you're in an adult faith group, and something comes up. Say there's some new bomb goes off in Rome, and you want some insight. Or for God's sakes, people, if you were coming to Rome and you want restaurant recommendations, okay? This is where I truly shine. Okay? But whatever it is, if I can be a resource, I would be delighted to do that. I have an online column that is called All Things Catholic. So if you just Google or whatever, All Things Catholic, John Allen, my email address is at the bottom of that column. Okay, you can contact me that way. Now, please put like World Catholicism Week or something in the subject line. So I don't think the 7th Nigerian prince today is going to give me $30 million if I just give him my bank account information, right? But assuming you permeate my spam filter, if I can be a resource or help to you, I would be delighted to do that. Because, I move around talking this talk about the need to get beyond tribalism and to rebuild zones of friendship. But if I mean that, obviously, I also need to walk the walk. So my point is that if I can be of help to you, it's not going to be a burden or an imposition. It's going to be a chance for me to feel like a person of integrity. Okay, so take advantage of that. Thank you. God bless you.